Hi again. In the last video I discussed pride in general and how it can be a form of protest in the context of minority groups. I want to look how this can help us understand poetry through one famous Audre Lorde poem, A Litany for Survival. Born in 1934 to immigrants from the West Indies, she grew up in Harlem. While working as a librarian, she developed a literary and activist career as well. She described herself as black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet. She also fits other minorities that we discussed in this course. She was a second generation to immigration and also disabled. She was so nearsighted that she was considered legally blind as a child. In this course, I often concentrated on one aspect of a writer's identity and bracketed, put aside other aspects. For instance, I talked about Gloria Anzaladua's Mexican identity, but didn't really discuss how her sexual orientation was part of her writing. This was for the sake of convenience and clarity and focus. With this poem, there really is no need for ignoring any part of her identity. The idea that minority identities coexist in the same individual and affect each other is sometimes called intersectionality, but I'm not going to go into this complex issue here. There's a lot of information, some of it contradictory, on the internet if you're interested. Lorde wrote poetry, autobiographies, and very influential theoretical essays. She is known for writing that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. It's the title of one of her most important essays. This sentence, that has become a kind of aphorism or saying, suggests that people from downtrodden groups, from marginalized groups, need to develop their own vocabulary and concepts, their own tools, if they want to reshape the world, dismantling the old oppressive order, the master's house, in the process. If you keep using the dominant tools for thinking, for instance, if you're black, if you are only referring to white and European philosophers in your thinking, you will not be able to dismantle the dominant system. So if you keep using the dominant tools, the master's tools for thinking, you will not be able to dismantle the dominant system. Lorde had a very difficult life, especially growing up. I don't need to go into the details here. You can read her autobiography, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. She was also a controversial figure in her lifetime. Again, we don't need to go into the details. But know that when she speaks of survival, she probably knows what she's talking about. My argument about the poem A Litany for Survival is that it is a poem about how survival should be a source of pride, and that this pride is needed if you wish to resist and protest. Litany is a kind of prayer where the priest, the Catholic priest, says a few lines and the congregation answers or repeats. So the whole poem becomes a kind of prayer of hope, but one that requires a community. It needs an audience to repeat it. I suggest that you read the whole poem before continuing the video. I'm going to read the whole poem, but not interpret each and every line. So, A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live in the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. The poem opens with an address to a group that includes the speaker, for those of us. This phrase repeats several times in the first two stanzas. It is an anaphora, recurring opening of a line. It indicates that much of the poem is about describing this kind of person, this group of people, but also addressing them. So it's not just talking about them, it's also talking to them and for them. So, who is this poem addressing? The group is described here at first metaphorically, those who live on the shoreline, in a place that's between solid ground and the ocean, living in a place where they are always they living in a place where they always need to make decisions, perhaps life and death decisions between surviving on land and drowning in the sea. It's not 100% clear yet, but I think that's what's suggested. For those of us who cannot indulge in the passing dreams of joy, unlike perhaps people living inland and not on the shoreline, those people who can imagine that they can do whatever they want, can perhaps make mistakes that won't hurt them, the people Lorde is talking about have no freedom of choice and cannot even lie to themselves that they do. To those who love in doorways, coming and going, another liminal space, like the space between the ocean and the land, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once, before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouth, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. The speaker's dreams here are all dead. She will never achieve everything she hoped for. They are also dead, I think, because she is awake, because she's awake at a very early hour, before the dawn. But there's also a hope for the future generation. There's hope that they will have it better, that the dreams that they are dreaming, maybe they're still asleep, like you can imagine the children sleeping in a room while the mother is already awake, preparing for the day, will not be ruined. So the children's dreams will not be ruined because of the speaker's bad experience, maybe trying not to pass the trauma and the desperation on to the next generation. For those of us who are imprinted with fear, fear is a constant feeling that becomes part of the personality. It is imprinted in a way that cannot be removed, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk. For by this weapon, fear is described as a weapon, something that is used against you. We sometimes, I think of fear, or at least of being careful or cautious, as something that keeps us safe, that protects us. But the speaker says it is the tool of the oppressors. So for this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us by promising safety, by teaching us to be afraid. The heavy-footed, this is a noun here, the heavy-footed are the people who oppress us, the oppressors. Were trying to silence the speaker and people like her. By promising safety, by making you afraid, they make you stop talking. They silence you. She's saying that the message sent to them, to those who survived, was keep silent, be afraid and careful, and you will not be hurt. You will be safe, as long as you are silent. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. But the speaker thinks this promise of safety is a manipulation. It's a manipulative lie, because they were never meant to survive. The promise of safety was false. The heavy-footed oppressors didn't think they were going to survive, they didn't want them to survive. Surviving at all is therefore a triumph. It's a success, a win against the oppressors. Still, she describes how fear affects every aspect of their lives, of this group of survivors' life. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. There is no escaping fear because it's imprinted on you. When we eat, we are afraid of stomach problems. When we are hungry, we fear we will never have any food. Same goes for emotion. When we are loved, we feel it must run out. We're not going to be loved forever. When we are not loved, we are sure that there will never be love for us. This is a no-win situation and it seems very hopeless. This situation recurs with the issue of speaking out and keeping silent. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcome. The fear is that people will not care or even will react in hostility if we say anything. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. But not speaking does not prevent fear. You're always going to be afraid. The conclusion of these two oppositions is actually surprisingly active and hopeful. So instead of giving up, her conclusion is that you should do something. She suggests if we are afraid anyways, then she writes, I'm reading from the poem, so it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Why should we speak? Why should we speak out in confidence? Probably against the wrongful things that are done to us. Why should we speak against these wrongful things? I think it is not just because they are afraid anyways, like the poem says, but because they can remember that the heavy-footed, the oppressors of all kinds never meant them to be safe, never meant them to live at all. They were expected to give up and perish. There's a lot of justified pride in asserting that you were not expected to survive, not meant to survive, and yet you did, and you are here, and you are speaking about it. You are speaking despite all the odds, that all the odds are against you, and there's pride in that. This pride is the power that leads to speaking, to protesting, to resisting. Audre Lorde explicitly celebrates pride in survival. She insists that members of downtrodden groups, marginalized groups, should speak up thanks to that pride.